Over its nearly 20-year history, the Halo franchise has played host to a myriad of unique and diverse weapons, with each new FPS Halo game introducing new members to the Halo weapons sandbox. But almost as fast as Halo games introduce new weapons, it gets rid of them too. No, seriously, for a new weapon to survive more than one Halo game is a major feat, and if you see a new weapon survive longer than 2 games, it's almost akin to witnessing a miracle. I'm the Home Slice, Ascend
A small price to pay for salvation.
Hyperion, and today I'm launching a new series where we explore Halo's long and violent history of creating and destroying weapons. And to kick us off, we'll be discussing the strange and interesting evolution of the grenade launcher weapon class in Halo, as we comb through Halo's catalog of grenade launchers from 2004 all the way up to 2021. Like always, stick around for my viewer question at the end, and let's get this started. It's a good idea that we start with me defining the terms I'll be using today. Now, the term grenade launcher in many other first-person shooter games is very literal, guns that launch grenades. Because Halo's weapon sandbox is focused more on weapon function rather than weapon title, the functions of some of these weapons vary a little from what you might see in a COD or Battlefield game. Approach with open minds and open hearts. But if you need to be eased into today's topic with a more definition-friendly weapon, well, you're in luck. We're traveling back to 2004 to discuss the Brute Shot. This gun is unique for a few reasons. It's the first true brute category weapon, it's the first grenade launcher in Halo, it's the first weapon to make a major adoption of the bouncing projectiles gimmick that would later go on to be fully realized in the scatter shot and eventually the heat wave. But did you know that in Halo 2, the Brute Shot actually gave players a melee advantage? Yeah, that's right. The giant blade wasn't just for show in Halo 2. The Brute Shot allows you to melee faster and deal twice as much damage than a normal melee. In fact, if you meleeed somebody in the air with the Brute Shot, it granted an insta-kill. So, funny enough, at the inception of the grenade launcher weapon class, the oldest weapon isn't even really just a dedicated grenade launcher. It's also a mini melee weapon, which partially inducts it into one of the most scarce weapon classes in all of Halo. And if we take a step back to observe, we can see the Brute Shot has a lot going on. Halo 3 is about to change that. 2007 brings us another Brute Shot, but this time with no bouncing projectiles, no real poppable melee advantage, especially no insta-kills, and a small extension of the total shots per chain. With an increase in ammo capacity came a decrease in shot damage. But something really important is about to happen here. Despite the damage decrease though, the Brute Shot was still a formidable weapon to challenge, especially at mid to close range, as its projectiles emitted a fairly disruptive explosion, especially upon impact. But the one thing the Halo 3 Brute Shot did that would be very important for years to come was how it affected vehicles. Traditionally, explosive weapons were the natural counter to vehicles, usually resulting in near instant, if not instant, destruction. But because of how the Brute Shot projectiles worked, a user could defeat a vehicle not by directly blowing it up, but by sending it flying in the air. The Brute Shot traded its secondary perks as a melee weapon for the secondary perk of being an excellent vehicle disabler, as forcing players out of a vehicle is almost as effective as an insta-kill in a way. But between me and you, it's also just good fun to see a Warthog go tumbling at Mach 3 through Sandtrap when they decide to pursue the wrong player. And it's this quirk here, this focus on vehicle disabling, that would go on to shape what would be the successor to the Brute Shot, the Concussion Rifle. Halo Reach and Halo 4 feature what is described as the elite counterpart to the Brute Shot, but like I just alluded to, this weapon was less about dealing high explosive damage and more about dealing high levels of knockback and disruption. Both iterations of the Concussion Rifle are notorious as vehicle killers, simply because of how quickly and violently they destabilize and overturn vehicles. But that power that allows the Concussion Rifle to stop, flip, and overturn vehicles doesn't end with vehicle combat. The Concussion Rifle can bring players to a dead stop. A concussion rifle could be a fairly strong solo performer, but the real strategy is to have a buddy who can belt at precise damage while you freeze a player in place or pin them against a wall with this giant plasma slinging machine. And I want to take a slight pause here to call your attention to something. Look how much the grenade launcher option has changed in just 6 years alone. Some people might make the argument that the concussion rifle is a bad, quote-unquote, iteration of the brute shot because it isn't the strongest from a power perspective. But actually, this evolution is fueled by one of the most important things in Halo's weapon sandbox: function. Any gun can deal high amounts of damage, but what will really solidify a weapon's place in the sandbox is how it deals that damage. The concussion rifle, for me, represents a positive recognition of a unique trait, and then a clever adaptation of that trait into a mainstay function. And if you watched my video about how the heat wave is a clever evolution of the scatter shot, you can probably recognize how much of what I said there can be said for the concussion rifle as well. But what happens when an iteration hits a proverbial peak? How do we iterate on what could have been a finality? In the case of Halo 5, we generate a divergence. The Plasma Caster. Let's ask the question, what if? And travel back to 2010's Halo Reach. What if, instead of focusing on the disruption mechanic of the brute shot, the goal was to create a stronger, more violent grenade launcher? The answer is the Plasma Caster. This puppy is a damage-dealing machine, and what's even crazier is how it can be charged up to deliver a cluster bomb that generates multiple successive explosions. Oh, and that charged projectile can stick to players and vehicles, converting any enemy into a volunteer suicide bomber at the flick of a trigger. And this is subjective, but God, I love how this thing sounds. It's also extremely interesting how the Plasma Caster is also a visual sibling to the concussion rifle, almost as if 343 was acknowledging the design family the weapon comes from. And while design focuses on damage alone can be misguided, I do think 343 took special care when designing the alternate firing mode to not just be a second round of Halo's 4's incineration cannon. I think the point was to allow players to swiftly and effectively alter their fight approach. Similar to how the heat wave can switch firing pattern, the Plasma Caster being able to change projectile type allows it to be a direct damage dealer to players and vehicles, as its sister, the concussion rifle, does that more indirectly. In 2021, the mantle of grenade launcher is going to be picked up by another new weapon, the Ravager. Functionally, the Ravager seems to be more akin to the Halo 3 brute shot and the Plasma Caster, as a damage-oriented explosives factory. It's unclear, at least at the time of me making this video, how much the Ravager borrows, iterates, or otherwise abandons from the guns before it, but it's fair to assume this weapon is probably intended more for use against players rather than vehicles. There's also a noted emphasis on AoE damage with the Ravager, a new kind of path that borrows from the Plasma Caster's mentality. All in all, the grenade launcher weapon class in Halo is one of the most diverse and greatly iterated in the Halo franchise, especially when compared to more stagnant weapon classes like the shotguns or the snipers. But what's great about them is how they represent Halo's commitment to placing weapon function higher than weapon damage. In Halo, gameplay is dictated by the decisions you can make with the tools in your hands, and the grenade launcher class has been a great experimentation grounds for what players can do with bladed guns, lesser explosives, and alternate firing modes. That leads us into today's question. What do you think made the grenade launcher class so apt to experimentation? Why couldn't we see so much diversity in other weapon classes like shotguns or SMGs? That's gonna do it for today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't, follow me on Twitter, and join my Discord. Until next time, I'll catch y'all later.